Support for this video comes from Skillshare, which offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. In this episode of the conservation of this panel painting, we're going to be focusing entirely on the bonding process. That is, taking it from 6 pieces and unifying it into one solid panel. In last episode, you saw me building this machine, a device meant to clamp and hold the panel painting in place and facilitate more control and better alignment than is possible with hand clamps, bar clamps, and cawls. Now, the first thing I need to do is position the panel painting on the machine. And it's resting on those oak battens, and I can slide the top trellis along the crack that I'm going to be bonding. I can loosen up these clamp bodies and slide them into position. Now I have 5 positioned on this top trellis and 5 below, and I think that's going to be enough. If I felt that there was a need for more clamps or less, I could take from the other trellis or take some off of this one, but I think 5 will be enough. So once I've gotten them in the position that I want, I can raise up the table. And I spent a lot of time talking about how nifty of a trick this was, but this is precisely why I wanted to have this feature built in, even though it was an added expense and a lot more work to make it happen. Because here I'm just squatting down and maneuvering this clamp body into position. I don't have to crawl on my hands and knees underneath this table or sit on a rolling dolly or lay down to get to these clamp bodies. And that makes a big difference because I'm going to have to do this quite a bit to bond this painting back together, and the less I have to squat down and get up and crawl around, the easier it is on my body and the faster the whole process goes. Now I'm orienting these bottom clamps to match the position of the top clamps because I want to make sure that the pressure is even and is met by both clamps. Now the adhesive that I'm using for this is a modified hide glue, and the reason that I'm using hide glue is that I can modify it such that it will operate and work at room temperature rather than requiring heating. Now I did warm it up just a little bit just to thin it out because it was a little thicker than I liked. Now I'm going to apply it liberally to the entire surface of this panel. And because this is a modified hide glue, it has a long open time, and so I don't really have to rush as if it were a standard hide glue. Now once I've got the entire panel covered in glue, I can place it into position and orient the pieces together. And this is really where the magic or success of this whole table comes into play. I'm going to take these little blocks of MDF, which have a piece of wool felt and silicone release film adhered to the bottom so that they don't deform the painting or stick to the glue. I'm going to place them across the seam where the 2 panels come together, and then I'm going to apply some downward pressure with the clamp bodies. And I want to make sure that the pressure is evenly distributed and that it helps align this seam. And once I've gotten all the top clamps into position, I can do the same thing with the bottom clamps. And this is important because I need pressure from both the top and the bottom to hold this seam in place. And that's why having this trellis with clamps on the top and bottom is really important. Now, it's right about now when I'm having to screw all these clamps in that I'm glad that I opted to install those little knurled handles as opposed to using the key before. Once I've gotten the alignment of the top and bottom clamps just how I like them, I can start to apply horizontal pressure to close the seam. And these clamp bodies with the aluminum handles and larger feet will allow me to apply that pressure to the edge of the painting and close that seam up. Now I'm using little blocks of wood just so that these feet don't damage the edge of the painting because of course that's another seam that I'm going to have to glue later. And once I've gotten the sideways pressure how I like, I'm going to go back in and do minor adjustments with the vertical pressure, making sure that the seam is well aligned and closed nice and tightly. Now, I'm not too worried about glue spilling out from that joint because I can always remove that later on. Now, even though I'm using an adhesive with a long open time, I still have to move fairly quickly. I can't take too much time because, of course, that adhesive, even though it dries very slowly, it does start to dry. And once that process happens, it's going to be much harder to make any changes. So I'm going to go back and forth, adjusting each of the points of contact, the vertical pressure from the top, the vertical pressure from the bottom, and then the horizontal pressure from the clamps mounted on the edge of the table. And really, this is just a matter of going back and forth and making sure that I've got the type of pressure that I want on each contact point and making sure that the seam is closed and that the panel isn't deforming. This is just like if I was going to use clamps and cauls and do it by hand, but instead of worrying about things coming undone and falling apart, I can just loosen them up, slide them over, make an adjustment, move on to the next one, loosen it up, reposition the clamping pad, tighten it back down. Not having to manage the position of the wood panel itself and worry about if it's going to fall down or if it's sliding or if some of the other clamps are losing their position is really of great benefit. And that's really the whole reason that I built this table. And so you can see I'm just going back and forth, adjusting, readjusting, adjusting, readjusting. And this probably took about 10 or so minutes altogether, which doesn't seem like a lot of time, but it really is when you think about it. Now I'm just going to go along to the edge and I'm going to add a couple of little C-clamps on the absolute edge of the painting, just where I want to make sure that there's a little bit of pressure. I can't apply pressure on the edge with these clamping blocks that I designed because they'll slide right off. And so that's where these little pads and a little C-clamp come in handy. And this isn't really to do much other than hold everything in place. It's more of a registration issue than clamping for adhesion properties. It's just going to make sure everything is as it should be. And now I can lower the table down back to its standard position, and I can take a look at the first trial run of this clamping table. So far, I'm pretty happy. The seam has aligned really well. I don't have any lip or edge that's going to cause a problem later on. The process went fairly smooth. I didn't break out in a sweat. I didn't get myself covered with glue. And yes, that's happened in the past. And it seems like the table is holding everything where it should. So on the first go-round, I'm pretty happy with how everything has performed. And we can see that the clamping table is really doing its job by providing active and passive control on this panel. That is, the clamps are actively closing up that seam, and the table is passively holding the panel in place so that the clamps can do their work. So, from the looks of it, I think this is a success, but of course we'll have to wait until everything is dry to see. Now I've let the panel dry for a day or so, and I can come back now to remove all of the clamping pressure and all of these little blocks and see how everything worked. Now removing the panel from the clamping table is pretty easy, and you can see that if the little blocks stick to the adhesive, they pop right off because of the silicone release film. And we'll take another look at it right here. Pops right off, no problem. No paint comes with. Now, removing the sideways pressure, I'm going to do it a little more carefully because I don't want to cause any spring back or any sudden change in the position of the panel. But again, it looks like everything has worked really well. I'm not seeing any deformations in the panel when I remove the pressure. Sometimes that can happen when you clamp something. When you take the clamps off, the thing you were clamping can spring back or distort. And so that none of that is happening is an indication that this first run really was successful. Now, that the first joint was successful is great, but I still have 4 more to go, and as I continue on with this clamping process, the pieces are going to get larger and larger until I glue the last piece back on together, and it's going to get more and more complicated, which is precisely why I started off with a very small piece. I wanted something that was really easily controlled and not too much to bite off and chew. So again, I'm going to repeat this process pretty much the exact same way that I did it before. I'm using that same hide glue. It's warmed up. It's just in a little plastic tray sitting over some warm water. It's kind of like a double boiler. Just want to warm it up enough that it is a little bit easier to work with and not so thick. And I'm going to apply it to the entire edge, and I'm going to apply it liberally. Again, I don't care if there's squeeze out. Because this is hide glue, I can remove it with some warm water or some vinegar, and ultimately, this painting still is covered with old surface grime and old varnish. So if it sticks to anything, it's not sticking to the original paint layer. And that's one of the reasons why I left all of the grime and the varnish on this painting. Just an added layer of protection as I handle it and as it gets exposed to this adhesive. Now I'm going to set all of the clamps and I'm going to slowly move my way through. Now, one thing that I have to keep a note here is that even though the first process went very well, in my opinion, there were some things that I noticed that I wanted to do differently. That's not to say that there were any failures, but like anything, there is a process of evolution, a process of learning from what you're doing and modifying your behavior the next time so that you have better chances of success. And one of the things I'm doing here is instead of moving from one clamp to the next, I'm moving from one and then I'm moving to the other end of the panel, and then back to the other end of the panel. So I'm starting at the outer edges and then moving into the center when I apply that horizontal pressure. Because I learned from the first time that if I don't do it that way, it starts to twist and distort the entire assembly, and then the trellis, which is placed over that seam, isn't correctly aligned. So again, just a process of constantly learning and making sure that I'm always taking in new information. And, my job is really unique in that it requires me to always be learning. I mean, I read 2,500 pages worth of white papers before I even started this project. And that's one thing I really, really love about my job, is that it requires me to always be challenging myself and always be learning. And it also affords me that opportunity. But not all of us have jobs that require us to constantly learn or even allow us to constantly learn. And with Skillshare, it doesn't have to be your job. In fact, it shouldn't be your job. It should be your passion, your creativity, something that inspires you, something that you'd like to pursue maybe just for yourself. Turn a passive hobby like watching conservation videos into an active hobby like painting. And so, if you're at all interested in oil painting, maybe I can suggest oil painting with Walt Renemo. You may as well get started now. I mean, who knows? In 100 years, maybe one of your paintings will end up on the future version of YouTube as a conservator works to fix it for future generations. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 2-month free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. Okay, everybody feels smarter, empowered, and ready to tackle the next great American painting? Good, I'm glad. So, just as last time, I'm going through and making those micro adjustments, keeping an eye on that seam to make sure that it's closed nice and tightly and that it's not distorting or shifting positions and creating a lip that would otherwise be problematic. So, adjustment, assess, adjust, assess, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat. It's nothing fancy here, but making sure that I take the time to do it all and keep it as a controlled process is what benefits the overall outcome. And just like last time, I'm applying these little C-clamps to the edges, and just like last time, they're not really doing anything other than making sure that this edge of the painting doesn't distort or lift up or press down. It's just a little added insurance and can't hurt, so why not do it? And now as I move on to the final and the most complicated of the seams, I have 2 large pieces of wood, and I have a seam that runs almost in the middle of the panel. And the difficulty with bonding this panel back together is that it's not flat. It undulates. That is that some of these panels are convex and some are concave and some are more than the others. And so this panel is kind of like a noodle. And this is where it gets complicated because I have to make sure that when I bond this panel back together, it's in the position that would allow the two convex pieces to be joined in the state they were in before they split. I know that sounds really complicated and kind of obtuse, but I want to make sure that when I glue this panel together, if the whole thing were convex and bowing out, that it's glued together in that position so that we have the maximum surface area for the glue joint. Now, to do that, this whole table allows for me to apply that clamping pressure on a distorted panel. But one of the things that I have to keep in mind is that as this panel gets bigger, and because it's convex, as I put the pressure horizontally to close that joint up, the panel is going to further distort. That is, as I tighten the clamps on the sides, it's going to press that convex panel up more, and it's going to get more and more convex to the point where it may burst. And that's where having this second trellis is absolutely critical. Now you see I've placed these larger clamping pads down, and these are the same thing that these small ones are. They're just much longer. It's just a piece of MDF and a piece of wool felt and silicone release film. But what these are going to do in conjunction with this second trellis is that they are going to help resist some of that deflection that's naturally going to happen when I put clamping pressure on the sides. That is, they're going to allow the panel to bow out a little bit. They'll allow it to become a little bit more convex without allowing it to become so convex that it splits. This is a thin panel, and if I don't do this, it's pretty possible, in fact, I'm certain that the sideways clamping pressure that's required to close that joint will cause this panel to just pop out. Now, in terms of pressure, I'm not adding a ton. For the vertical clamps, it's really just a registration system. So I'm almost using, it's very, very little pressure, maybe 25 psi. For the sideways clamps that close up the seams, I'm using a little bit more, maybe about 90 to 120 psi. Now, that may sound like hieroglyphics, but think of it this way. A woodworker building a piece of functional furniture, a chair, a table, might use 200 to 300 psi depending on the species of wood, the adhesive used, and the type of joint being glued together. And that's required to get an absolutely rock-solid functional joint. Now, this panel painting isn't a table. It's not a chair, and it's not going to be subject to any unnatural forces. That is, nobody's going to plop down on top of it, and nobody's going to be serving dinner on top of it. So it's not going to be subject to that same kind of stress that a piece of furniture would be. So the requirements for the pressure on the glue joint are much lower. So I can get away with 90 to 125, 150 psi and close that joint up and get a good bond because I don't have to worry about it being a structural joint. In addition, I'm going to be doing something to this painting later on that's going to take almost all of the burden of holding the painting together away from these seams, these joints. So really, what I'm doing here is just trying to align the painting so that it's glued back together and held together, if only temporarily, until I finish this conservation. Now you can see here how the panel distorts. It goes down, then it goes up, and then it goes down again. It's kind of like an S or a zigzag, and that's necessary for a successful glue joint because that's how the wood wants to exist. And that's why this table construction was so important. I just couldn't effectively glue this together using basic cauls and bar clamps. It's too large of a painting, and the issues that the seams present, not to mention the issues that the wood present, were too complex to manage with bar clamps and cauls and other improvised tools. So building this table was absolutely critical, and without it, I'm not sure that I would have the same degree of success. It's certainly possible that doing it by hand would be successful, but it would be exponentially more stressful, and I would like to remove any stress I can from the way I work. It makes working much easier and success a greater possibility. All right, moment of truth. Hopefully, as I loosen up the pressure on this panel, it doesn't A, burst open, B, flop to the ground, or C, rip a hole in the space-time continuum. I don't know. I've never used this table before, so I'm not sure what powers it has. Let's give it deference. Now I'm removing the pressure slowly, and I'm keeping an eye on the panel because I know that it's going to distort a little bit when it comes out of the clamps. I mentioned that earlier, and because this piece is now really large, that distortion might be noticeable. So I'm going slowly and loosening it up just a little bit at a time, just to make sure that I have the utmost control. And this is actually another benefit of the painting. Obviously, applying the pressure is easier with a system like this, with this machine. But removing the pressure is also much, much easier. I don't have to worry about a clamp falling down or slipping and scratching the painting. Everything is in place, so all I have to do is keep an eye on the panel itself and monitor what it's doing and adjust my actions accordingly. The clamps are going to take care of themselves. So with all of the pressure removed, I can slide these trellises out of the way so that I can remove this painting from this medieval torture contraption, and I can take it on to the next steps. Now again, these little clamping pads aren't going to stick to the painting by design, and I'll save them for future use. I accidentally made like 50 of these little things because I didn't know how many I was going to need, and I didn't know if they were going to get destroyed. Now removing this panel from this clamping table is very, very precarious because it's huge, and I don't want to scratch the painting. I don't want to bang the painting or bump into anything, and I also want to get the painting into a different orientation so that all of the stress is gone. Right there, that's how I want to transport the painting. Now there were a couple of little voids, missing pieces of wood that I noticed after I glued the panel back together. And here I'm just cutting a piece of oak, and I'm going to shape this and use it to fill in those voids. Now this isn't going to be structural or anything like that. It's really just to fill that gap and provide a base for the fill-in material to stick to. So really nothing all that complicated, just a chisel and the wood and working on making it fit that little gap. Now I probably should have done this before I glued the panel back together, but I didn't. So I have to do it now. Lesson learned. Just one of those things that I will have to be more conscious of in the future. So a little bit of sandpaper, and again, just shaping this so that it will ultimately slide into the little void nicely with not a lot of gap and won't need a lot of adhesive. And like I mentioned, this is just to fill that space. And we can see that it's not a huge space, but it still needs to be filled because once the painting's in the frame, if I don't fill it, that'll show. So, piece of cake. Now at this point, the panel has been bonded back together and it is fairly stable. You can see that it's not flopping around or distorting too much, but it's not completely stable. And now I can finally face the painting with the Kozo. Unlike previous papers I've used before, this one is fairly heavy at about 80 grams. For comparison, what I normally use is about 10 grams, and that's just a measure of the weight. It's grams per square meter. And so at 80 grams, it is pretty thick. I would say like a heavy cardstock. And it's flexible and incredibly strong. And so it's going to conform to this painting surface, which luckily doesn't have a lot of impasto or texture. But the strength is really what I'm looking for here, because the next few steps that I'm going to be taking on this painting are going to require that this facing be a little bit more than just superficially protective. That is, this Kozo may actually have to hold this entire painting together. So I need to make sure that it's strong enough and that it has a really good bond, which is why I applied the fish gel to the face of the painting first. And once I rub the kozo out and remove some of the air bubbles, I will apply another layer of adhesive to penetrate through that paper down to the painting and make sure that I have a very strong and secure bond, because I don't want this paper going anywhere. Now, ultimately, I chose to use a water-based adhesive because I'm going to be using some petroleum solvent-based adhesives later on, and I need to make sure that they don't interact with each other. Otherwise, this facing could come off, and, well, I really need it to stay put.
So now we've come to a point in this painting's conservation where a couple of decisions need to be made about where we go from here. And some may feel that this is a fine place to stop dealing with the structure of the piece and turn our attention to the face. And that is clean the painting, fill in the losses, retouch it, varnish it, get it back in the frame, and get it off to the client. But I'm not okay with that, because I'm concerned and actually fairly confident that if the structural issues aren't further dealt with, given the fragility of this piece and given where it's going, it's going to continue to distort, and it's going to split again. And that's not something I would be okay with. Because as a conservator, it's not only my responsibility to deal with the issues from the past up until this point, but also to deal with the issues that may present themselves in the future and head them off at the pass. So what exactly does that mean? Well, before I started this project, I started researching panel paintings, their history, their construction, their materials, their conservation. And I tapped into the wealth of information put together by various organizations like the American Institute for Conservation, the Getty Foundation, the Canadian Conservation Institute, even the U.S. Forest Service. And after consuming roughly 2,500 pages of white papers and reports, I reached what was probably an inevitable point of saturation and information overload. And so I turned to some conservators who I know, trust, and respect to get their opinions, to see if they could cut through some of the fog that I felt I was mired in. And after going back and forth and brainstorming, we settled on a solution that we all felt comfortable with, one that would address the structural issues that this panel has, while maintaining reversibility, archivability, and of course, adhering to all of the ethical guidelines that modern conservators follow. So what does all of that mean? Well, in short, I'm going to be adding a structural support to this panel. But of course, it's not that simple. Nothing's that simple. Because if we remember, this panel has varying thicknesses, and so I can't simply add something to the panel. I have to get a uniform surface. And that means I have to remove some of the back of this panel. And that may sound crazy or bonkers, and it kind of is. And had this painting come to me in a virgin state, that is, had nobody tinkered with it before, it would be bonkers and totally verboten, and I wouldn't even consider it, because we no longer view the panel, the structure of the artwork, as disposable. But, of course, this painting isn't in a virgin state. Somebody, maybe many people, have tinkered with it in the past. They planed the panel down to varying degrees of thickness. They carved channels into the painting. They undermined the structural integrity of this panel. And so I have to now deal with the mess that's landed in my studio. I have to play cleanup. That ship has sailed. That bell has been rung. That teacup has broken. I would much rather have this painting never have been worked on and in a million little pieces than have it in the state where somebody has tried to fix it but caused more harm than good. So I'm going to be removing some of the mass of this piece to create a uniform thickness panel and one that will give me the maximum surface area for the bonding. But I can't just remove the mass of the panel, because the panel is warped, it's cupped, it's distorted. And I first have to deal with that before I can even think about getting it into a uniform state. And so how do you flatten a piece of wood and keep it flat for the long term? Well, let's find out.